Welcome, everybody, and welcome back to our series on risk management. I am really excited to have you all here today because we have a dynamite guest today. Let me introduce you to Jack Jones, who is a co-founder of RiskLens out of Spokane, Washington. And I could talk about RiskLens for a long time, but I'm going to ask Jack to introduce himself just briefly and maybe talk only for a couple minutes about RiskLens, so we can then get into some questions and answers from Jack, because he's got a great story to tell and there's some very interesting perspectives I want us to get at. So Jack, I'll turn it over to you if you mind telling us a little bit about you and RiskLens, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I've been in technology since the early 80s and the security side of things since the late 80s, and began in a very technical role down in the guts of the systems, fighting viruses and whatnot. And, worked my way through the ranks, if you will, and into management, worked for a while in government intelligence, and then was in the consulting world doing attack and penetration work and whatnot. And then ended up as a CISO, pretty much completely unprepared for the role. And had to learn the hard way about how to make security work for the business, and which is really sort of the theme then for the rest of my career. And I've been a CISO for 3 different companies and consulted a couple of, for a couple of different stretches in there. And for the last 11 years have been co-founder and chief risk scientist for a company called RiskLens. And RiskLens was the first software as a security or software as a service provider for cyber risk quantification. And in fact, we were alone in that realm for, better part of 10 years before competition began springing up just in the last couple of years. But really, that's, our focus in life as a company is to help organizations understand and measure risk better so they can make better informed decisions. And it just so happens that quantifying risk, cyber risk in this case, is an important component of that, because qualitative risk measurement has some inherent limitations from a decision-making support perspective. Mm-hmm. And as it turns out, quantification is not only doable, but it's not as hard as many people make it out to be. So.
Excellent. Let's just jump right into that, because I remember when we first met, we talked a lot about what you guys did in the quantification. And to be honest with you, it took me a while to really get there, sure. because it was hard. I don't have that kind of mind that focuses on that. I focus on more the esoteric. But once I got it, it made a lot of sense to me. And I know that a lot of our audience deals with boards of directors or investors that, well, that's nice to know, but tell me, what does it mean? How much does it cost? What can you quantify? Could you talk to us just a little bit on maybe a couple of basics around risk quantification and what we as individuals can do with regard to that, and how we can actually communicate that to somebody who asks the question?
Yeah. So first of all, whether you're measuring risk quantitatively or qualitatively, there's 3 things that have to exist before you can hope for either type of measurement to be defensible. First of all, you have to have a clear scope of what it is you're measuring. And that's one of the huge challenges and deficiencies I see over and over and over again in risk measurement in our industry is people will go, it's medium risk, without explicitly understanding what they just measured, right? Mm-hmm. This weak password is medium risk. Okay, what's the loss event scenario that weak password is relevant to? Who's the threat actor? What are the assets at risk? What controls might be in place that compensate for this in some fashion or are relevant also to the scenario? Somewhere tumbling in their mind and their mental model is some of this stuff. Maybe not all of it, but some of this, right? And they won't have explicitly, consciously thought of what they just measured, but they tossed out a measurement. And when I go into organizations and examine the risk measurements they've done, very often, 90+% of the time, they haven't scoped any of the measurements. None of the measurements had a clear definition of what was being measured. And if you don't have a clear definition of what you're measuring, it's kind of a crapshoot.
Yep.
So quantitative or qualitative, you have to have a clearly defined scope.
Yep.
You also have to have a model, right? Now that I know sort of what I'm measuring in my problem space, what are the elements I need to understand and evaluate in order to arrive at a risk measurement, and how do they relate to one another? How do they come together? And here again, when people are waving a wet finger in there, they have a mental model, again, somewhere in their head, but nobody knows, including they don't typically know what their mental model is explicitly. And everybody's is very often different to some degree. But if you want to measure risk well, you have to have a clearly defined model. What are the pieces, parts that go into this measurement, and how am I bringing them together? And the way I like to sort of drive home these last two elements, the clear scope and the model, is I like to ask people, how many of you in the course of work have had what feels like a religious argument with someone about whether something is high, medium, or low risk? And everybody's lived that countless times if they've been in the industry any length of time. And I say, my experience is the vast majority of instances, when you're having that religious debate with that person or people, in that moment, they aren't actually the morons that you think they are, and you're not the moron that they think you are. You're talking about different scopes. You have different undefined scopes in your mind, and you have different mental models, right? So of course you can't come to a clear agreement on it, because you're talking about very different things. And so again, you have to have this clear scope. You have to have a model, clearly defined model, and then you have to have data. And people will go on and on about the need for data and quantitative risk measurement. And nobody ever bothers to mention the fact that you have to have data for qualitative measurement as well. I mean, how else would you choose between high and medium and low? There's some sort of data is driving that determination. And again, most of the time, the wet finger in the air, we don't know what data is being applied. The person doing the measurement hasn't explicitly identified what data they're thinking of or applying to their undefined mental model in an undefined scope. And so, the bottom line is scope, model, data. You have to have it whether you're doing quantitative or qualitative. And once you have those three things, the quantitative is remarkably straightforward. But there's I'm about to have some noise here, so I'm going to have to pause.
Nothing like a little noise when we're talking risk. That's the risk we run.
Yeah, exactly. So, we're having some work done out here, and they're driving skid steers around and whatnot. Sorry about that. Anyway, you can snip that out. Yeah, I was going to say, you have those three foundational elements, but then there's one other thing when we're talking about quantitative measurement that people tend to get tripped up with when they first start trying to think about quantitative measurement. People lean towards precise measurements, discrete values. We have our risk is $1,351,000.25 or something, right? They're looking for a discrete value. That's completely unrealistic, and you don't get estimates around that like that around revenue projections. It's ranges and distributions, or cost estimates for big projects. It's ranges and distribution. It should be ranges of distributions for this as well. But people, that's not where they start thinking about it. But that's a huge component of what makes this practical is the ability to use ranges and distributions for our inputs and our outputs. And why that is so important is because if we're trying to think of a discrete value, we freeze because we can't come up with one that we're confident in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But if we're allowed to give a range, well, I think the frequency is between here and here, probably, here within that range. We can work with that, and people can begin to they become less frozen with it. And there are very well proven methods for arriving at these ranges and distributions, even when you have sparse data or even no hard data, where you're just working from a subject matter expert estimate. It's called calibration, making calibrated estimates. And there's a gentleman by the name of Douglas Hubbard who's written a number of books on measurement. I consider him to be the world's leading expert. And his books include How to Measure Anything.
Mm-hmm.
And another one is The Failure of Risk Management. And he talks about how to measure anything. And it's brilliant work. And so I highly recommend it. But once you understand these pretty straightforward processes and have these pieces in place, quantification is not nearly as difficult as people imagine it to be. Certainly it's not as bad as I had imagined it to be when I was first starting to get into it.
Yeah, I remember our conversations earlier, and that gave me a sense of comfort, because I always had that struggle intellectually of, okay, how do you quantify this stuff, and how do you get the data for the ranges so you're actually talking about something?
Yeah.
Another question, just to follow up on this point, and I appreciate the 3 points: the scoping of what you measure, the model, and the data. Do you have any suggestions or best practices around when you are talking to someone who has a wealth of intuitive or experience, knowledge based on experience, debating you when you have data, to bridge the gap? Because there's value in that experience and intuition, but there's also value in what the data tells you. Any suggestions or ideas on how you might bridge that gap?
Sure. One of the best ways is to sort of Socratically lead them through an analysis. Right? Let's take a scenario and let's begin to talk about what we think, how we'd approach a measurement of this, and what our conclusions might be and why they would be what they are, and that sort of thing. And it's remarkable how often people's, the light bulbs will go on through this process, because they'll go, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. And the clarity too, one of the other huge advantages to this approach and using the model I developed, which is called F.A.I.R, or Factor Analysis of Information Risk, is it provides clarity in terminology. It provides that model that I mentioned you need to have. But it, at least as important as those things, is it provides a framework for critical thinking. It allows us to sort of dissect this thing we're trying to measure. How much risk is associated with ransomware in our organization? How do we measure this? All right. It gives us a way to decompose that into these more digestible elements that we can think more clearly about, gather data on, and then using the model, then roll that up to a result. So it's very often, people don't like to be challenged in their beliefs.
Right.
But if you can lead them through an analysis where you're, again, just exercising critical thinking, it's doesn't even have to come off as a challenge to their experience or intuition. It's really just an exploration of, this ransomware thing. How do we measure that? How do we come up with something? How would we defend a result there? I mean, the person sitting across from you might believe that it's high risk. Okay, well, it might very well be. Let's figure out how we would defend that measurement to, if somebody were really poking and prodding at it, because that's that's one of the reasons I developed this stuff, is because I got tired of executives or arguments with others in the industry about risk measurements when I wasn't really prepared to defend it. I mean, I felt very strongly about it, and I had years and years of experience, but an explicit defense wasn't available to me. You know, it was, well, because I've been doing this for 15 years and this is how it is, you know, and if you're not bright enough to see it the same way, that's your problem. But you know, once I developed FAIR and began using that, it was just amazing the change it made in the conversations with my colleagues, the executives that I served, and that sort of thing. You know, I was able to show my homework, so to speak.
Yeah.
And have rational debates about assumptions, because there's always assumptions in any measurement of any complexity, certainly in the risk. And so it just changed the tone and nature of conversation completely, which by itself, you set aside sort of the value that quantitative measurement provides, and we can get back to what those value propositions are. But set that aside, just the clarity in conversation and the reduction of religious arguments was worth it all. So.
Excellent. Well, you led us right into one of the areas that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about. I know that when we met, you talked about FAIR, and to be honest, the first conversation was a little over my head, because I am one of those intuitive, experienced people, and if you don't agree with me, too bad for you. Okay. But as I got into it and I read your book, it was eye-opening to me, and it was actually much easier to understand. Yeah. Could you share with us just a little bit about FAIR, and then at the end of that, could you share where people are more interested in getting more details around that, how they can find you or whatnot and get information on that? I know you have certifications around this and whatnot, so we've got about maybe 5 or 6 minutes. Just let you spill your guts on what is FAIR, what's it all about, and maybe that will encourage some of our people to really take this quantification of risk a little more serious, but better yet, be better prepared to answer questions around it when they are asked, which I think is important. Yeah.
So FAIR is think of a diagram as a diagram, and there's a node at the top that's risk. That's sort of the value we're trying to arrive at.
Okay.
And below that is another level of abstraction called loss event frequency. How often bad things are likely to happen.
Right.
And loss magnitude, how much it's going to hurt when the bad things happen. And then below loss event frequency is threat event frequency. How often do events occur that could result in loss? Maybe they're attacks, or maybe they're human error, these sorts of things. And next to that is vulnerability, or susceptibility. In other words, what percentage of the time that these threat events occur will we result in loss?
Right.
That node above. And then below that, there are more sort of, there's another level of abstraction. These are threat event frequencies broken out, and vulnerabilities broken out into more discrete and specific elements. Again, just to help us sort of break down what it is we're trying to figure out and measure. And on the loss magnitude side, under the loss magnitude node, there's a primary loss and secondary loss. Primary loss being the loss that you experience directly as a result of the event. Maybe it's lost revenue because you've been down and lost financial haven't been able to process financial transactions. You know, those customers went somewhere else. Maybe it's replacement costs or response costs. So these direct losses as a result. But then the secondary loss node is, you can think of it as fallout. That's reputation damage. That's customer churn, which is really a function of reputation damage. Fines and judgments. Loss of competitive position, these sorts of things. So again, it just breaks down the problem into more specific elements, which allow us to think more clearly about what we're measuring and where we might get data. And again, so we have some thing like ransomware that we want to understand, and this model, this framework allows us to break it down into something that's, just a lot easier to think about and measure.
It sounds like with that model too, Jack, that one could actually talk about each of the components and explore or educate the audience on what those components could be and what they may be within certain discussions.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's again one of the value propositions of that very explicit model.
Yeah.
Which again is missing in most risk measurements, because it's someone's mental model, is this way to explore and have debates and dialogue, and that in a structured, rational way that isn't sort of, at least nearly as often, impinged by bias or ego or whatnot, right? It's really, we're talking about threat event frequency for this specific event. We're not thinking about this other event. This specific event, what's threat event frequency look like for that, and why do we think it's that range or distribution, and so on.
The other thing I like about the model is it applies for all market segments. It's not a financial services model, but it works in financial services, works in healthcare, works in energy, works in manufacturing. It kind of is broad in scope and can be applied to any market sector. So anyone who's listening to this that is in the service industry or a healthcare industry or a mining industry, it applies to them as well as credit unions, banks, and other financial services.
It's absolutely true. And interestingly enough, it's actually agnostic with regard to the risk domain. So there are organizations using it for health and safety, for natural disaster, excuse me, natural disaster. It's been used in the military. It's been used in legal and privacy domain. So I've used it to analyze my daughter's boyfriend. So it's really flexible.
Did they meet the requirement?
No.
You don't have to answer that.
Yeah. So yeah, that's another story for another time. But yeah, but it was helpful in thinking about the problem and coming up with a solution that I could defend.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, I like that. Okay. You and I are going to have coffee and talk about this boyfriend thing. I need to know more about that. Let me ask, we've got time for one more question, and then I do want to get some contact info from you for our audience. But I was noticing on the site, you have something called a rapid cybersecurity assessment.
Yeah, we have, you can think of it as sort of triage for an organization's risk landscape, because one of the, even if someone sort of wraps their head around the notion of clear scope, clear model and data, they often then are paralyzed by, where do I begin within my organization? Where do I start? And so this is a process for sort of parsing your organization and identifying risk themes, and then within those themes, more explicit risk statements or scopes and that sort of thing. So it helps you to parse your landscape into clearly defined risk statements, and then gives you what I think of as quick and dirty FAIR. Just applying it I almost want to use the word superficial, but it's not. You're just not spending a bunch of time digging for data. You're running with looser estimates, knowing they're looser estimates, but they're just a way to sort of begin to put things, in order, rough order of importance. And things will bubble to the surface then. These things over here that bubble to the surface through this triage, that's where we're going to dig in more deeply, right? And measure more explicitly and that sort of thing. And it's a great way for organizations to, in pretty short order, understand what their top risks are. Because, in the last 6 or 8 years, I've been given the opportunity to go into a number of organizations and look at their list of top cyber risks. We have our top 10 cyber risks. And not once, not one time in all these instances did they even come close to getting it right.
Really?
Yeah, not even remotely close.
Wow.
And
Wow.
it's because the typical approach in most organizations for arriving at their top 10 cyber risks is they get their top security people in the room, all these people with all that experience and intuition.
Yep.
And they argue with one another for 3 or 4 days, throwing stuff on the wall, and then generally the person with the most rank wins, and that's what the top risks are, is what they think they are. And unfortunately, very often the things in their list, 8 out of 10 of them aren't even risks. They're components of the risk landscape.
Right.
They aren't in and of themselves risks, and absolutely should not be considered, a top risk. It might be a really important concern, but it's, they're measuring apples and oranges and putting them all in the same basket and saying, it doesn't work. So, yeah.
That sounds, if you ever saw Moneyball, there's a scene where the new kid comes in and they got all the old scouts with all that intuition and that experience sitting around the table. They're saying, we need this guy, this guy, this guy. And this new kid has all the data and says, no, you don't. When you were talking,
you brought that up.
That's exactly what I was envisioning, was that kind of conversation.
And that is exactly what goes on. I'll have to remember that next time I get asked that question, because it's a perfect analogy. And I mean, I was a CISO before I came up with this stuff, and that's how we did it.
Yeah.
And when I talk to other CISOs, that's how they do it. And it's just, if you're lucky, some of that information is right, but very often it's biased and certainly incomplete. And because it's not arrived at in any sort of rigorous fashion, it can't be defended other than by saying, well, I'm the expert here.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I've had enough experience now in over 20 years of working with F.A.I.R and dealing with experts that, when I get into a debate with an expert on these things, it doesn't end well for them, just in terms of sort of, it's a very uncomfortable position for them because they can't show their homework.
Exactly.
And I can't.
Yeah, exactly.
And when I'm asking executive stakeholders to give me a boatload of money to spend on the stuff, in the cybersecurity stuff, I have a responsibility to be able to explain in language they understand why this matters and how much less risk they will have as a result.
Yeah.
Because if I can't explain that and defend it, I have no business asking for the money, in my opinion.
Fair enough.
And I think our experience is showing that, especially with COVID now, organizations having to tighten their belts, and a lot of CISOs and security organizations are having to explain themselves. And so we're seeing a lot more interest in this risk quantification because of that. So, it's unfortunately, that's what it took to bring about, the change of mind. But, it's, again, I think it's a responsibility, an obligation on our part to be able to show our homework and defend our positions. So
I would agree with that. This has been fascinating, Jack. I know our audience is going to love it. If they wanted to get in touch with you or RiskLens, what's the best way to do that?
Well, the best way to do that, my email at RiskLens is jjones@risklens.com. You could also just go to info@risklens.com. But there's also, for an organization or people out there who may be aren't sure they want to start with a conversation with a vendor,
Yeah.
maybe there's the FAIR Institute, which is fairinstitute.org.
Okay.
It's a nonprofit organization that we established about 6 years ago. It now has 14,000 members from around the world.
Wow. Excellent.
It has local chapters in 23 different cities globally. And so fairinstitute.org is just a wealth of white papers and videos and blog posts, and you will die of old age before you run through all the information that's out there. And so people might want to go there first to learn more about FAIR.
Uh-huh.
And then there's the other thing I'll mention is there's a group called the opengroup.org. It's just opengroup.org.
Uh-huh.
And that's an international consortium, a standards consortium, and they offer a certification in FAIR. And so they have training materials. And so people can go to opengroup.org and look for open FAIR. And because FAIR is an open standard, it's not proprietary. And so there's a wealth of that information. And then, as you mentioned, there's also the book that I co-authored a few years ago on FAIR that people can find on Amazon if they like.
That gives them plenty of opportunity to contact you guys and to delve more into that. Hey, Jack, thank you so much for joining us today. We may have to have you back because there's other questions I have in my mind, and you're just a wealth of good knowledge. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Really, really enjoyed this.